On behalf of us at ForeSpace, welcome to today's workshop on urban big data and privacy as related to research on the built environment. We'd like to thank Mohamed Ouf, Mazdak Nik-Bakth, Jing Hu, and Stefanie Duguay for inviting our participation today. Obviously, under normal circumstances, we'd welcome you into ForeSpace, which is an actual space at Concordia University dedicated to facilitating this kind of community building and knowledge sharing and impact through hands-on engaging experiences. But as you'll soon discover, today's event organizers have worked very hard to make this event interactive and accessible to all virtually. Sorry, my mouth hasn't woken up quite yet. Time for a second coffee. We have invited industry guests and researchers that will be taking the lead in tackling questions and brainstorming in the breakout rooms that you'll be going off to very soon. Those of you who feel more comfortable simply listening in and observing, no problem. You're invited to participate as little or as much as you see fit. So on that note, I'm just passing things off over to you, Mohamed.
All right, well, thank you, Anna, and thanks again, everyone, and good morning. I hope you can see my screen right now. Perfect. So so good morning, everyone, and welcome to our interdisciplinary workshop on using big data in built environment research. So my name is Mohamed Ouf. I'm an assistant professor at the Jing Hu School of Engineering and a member of the Center for Zero Energy Building Studies. And as I explained this, you will find out this is a very interdisciplinary workshop as part of a larger project that we're working on the different aspects of using data in building research. So, So just to introduce our team, we have 4 professors from different faculties that are working on this topic. We have Dr. Jing Hu from the Department of Philosophy, Dr. Mazdak Nik-Bakth from Building and Civil Engineering, myself also from Building and Civil Engineering, and Dr. Stefanie Duguay from Communication Studies. And before I get into explaining or giving an overview of this project, I just want to really acknowledge and thank everyone that's participating today. We have an impressive amount of people that are going to be part of these discussions that we will have throughout this morning. Representing different industries and academia, quite a good balance, and people that are dealing with data from different angles as well, which is really interesting to see come forward. So the goal of this project, like larger project that we're working on, that the 4 of us have received funding for earlier this year, is to try to look at the different aspects when we're dealing with big data in built environment research or in research in general, and especially when it comes with privacy and user trust and some of the other issues or ethical issues that can come up and we don't necessarily know how to deal with, let's say from an engineering perspective, for example. So the objectives of this workshop is really to make it, to do 2 things, and this is why we have the 2 roundtable discussions. The first one will be looking at trying to identify all the different types of data, the sources, the formats, how they're being stored, and what are the different use cases for such data. As you can see, we have a very diverse set of industries that generate data, but we want to think of how this can be used for basically built environment, like research related to the built environment, and we'll explain what we mean by that in just a few minutes. For the second roundtable discussion, we'll try to identify all the privacy and ethical issues that could arise, and this is, again, the second main component of this workshop. What we wanted to do here is just to take a different approach rather than just listening to presentations as we've been doing over Zoom for the past quite a while. What we've decided to do instead is to basically have a more engaging discussion and use these flipboards and try to have a different format so that people are really participating in these discussions here. So what do we mean by urban big data? Because this could be a buzzword and maybe some different people have different interpretations for what that means. So what we tried, or the definition we found that really encompasses what we want to mean or what we want to refer to as urban big data is according to 3 V's, and these indicate volume, so that it's often very large in size and usually not something that you can store locally or send over an email or something that's easier to handle. Velocity being the fact that it's continuously and automatically generated in or near real time. So think of, Twitter posts or, social media posts that are coming up all the time, data that's coming from buildings or different parts of the cities as well. And then variety, the fact that it comes in very different types and like shapes and formats. So it could be numeric data, it could be text, photos, and all of this can be analyzed quite differently. What we also need to define, just because we have a diverse group here, is what we mean by built environment research. And to us, we try to break it into two main components. One of them is building research. So that's looking at the bottom-up approach from the city for the city. So looking at buildings as how to design and improve the design and operations for buildings within the city. And then, if we take a bigger perspective, how do these buildings interact with each other and with the grid? And then the second aspect, which you'll be hearing about just in a few minutes as well, is infrastructure research, which is looking at this from a top-down perspective. So trying to look at how to optimize or improve the operation of the whole city infrastructure as a system, and then how this trickles down to the physical assets that could be buildings, transportation systems, and so on and so forth. So to just clarify a little more what the goal is in building research on this bottom-up approach is usually to improve two aspects for buildings, being energy efficiency and the indoor environment. So in order to do that, we need to understand the energy use patterns and the breakdown of energy usage within different buildings. So how does that change between different building types and even for buildings with the same type? And looking at also how this if we look at it from a temporal scale, and as we have more data, how this would look like as an energy use profile or pattern, and what does this affect, or how does it affect the peak demand of energy within those buildings? Same thing for indoor environment. There's quite a lot of data that could be acquired from the indoor environment, looking at contaminant concentrations, ventilation rates, and temperature, humidity control, and so on. We'll be exploring a lot of that in the first round table. But the idea here, and especially now with the context of the pandemic, this is really quite a big issue and something that a lot of people are paying attention to. What we're also interested in when we look at building research is that they're not very static. So what we've been working on, and it's a topic that has been growing a lot in the past few years, is the topic of occupant building interactions. And this, in this case, we look at occupancy patterns and how they change within different building zones. And then for occupant preferences, how they also change and what type of data can tell us what triggers occupants to interact with different building systems. Traditionally, the data sources we've been using is coming from the building systems or the automation systems, such as the meters and the sensors that are already installed in buildings. But then in some studies, we'll be adding or installing additional sensors. But the reason why we went for this project is that we're realizing there's a lot more data now that's being generated across cities. And in reality, this can give us a lot of information about how the dynamics of building operations in general. So the only issue is that this data is not typically centralized. It's mostly privately held, and there's a lot of questions about how this data can be used. What are all the privacy issues and everything that we'll be discussing. But what we also find is that even if this data was not necessarily generated for building research, we can actually use it and infer things about how buildings are occupied and how mobility interacts with building occupancy, for example. With all the IoT sensors and the smartphone apps and so on, we can start to infer information about occupant comfort, but at a much, much larger scale than individual buildings. And just some examples of this, we've been using or looking at the use of smart thermostats, for example, to understand heating preferences and cooling preferences in Quebec and Canada. And this, again, could be has been expanded in across North America or even different regions of the world. And what we're trying to do here is to try to come up with different groups and clusters that represent, let's say, the diversity of preferences that up until recently, we've always assumed to be the same for all residential buildings, for example, which we know is definitely not the case. The same thing, we use this data to understand occupancy patterns and try to infer the differences and the general trends that we see in different houses. And we use different sources for that too, such as Wi-Fi data streams, and looking at how the Wi-Fi counts, for example, in buildings correlate to occupancy. So we'll get into more detail about this in the first roundtable workshop, but now I'll pass the floor to Dr. Nik-Bakht to continue the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mohamed. This is Mazdak Nik-Bakth from Building Civil and Environmental Engineering. Our department has two programs. Mohamed comes from the building program and I come from the civil engineering program. So that's why we thought it might not be a bad idea to split the two aspects of the built environment. Mohamed provided a very nice view on buildings, but when we take a distant look at the city built environment, we see that even though buildings are one of the most important components, there are other urban infrastructure sectors as well, including the transportation, urban water, urban drainage, energy infrastructure. Also, some people count parks and telecom infrastructure as other sectors of urban infrastructure. In either case, each of these sectors of infrastructure have two major layers. Next, please. There's a as Mohamed mentioned, there's a physical layer of assets and a service layer, which is the function provided by each and every one of these sectors for living and working in a city. For example, if we take the case of transportation, we can think of the bridges, the tunnels, roads, highways, and so on, and also the fleet, the bus, the train, and so as the elements of the infrastructure, physical asset, and also the mobility as the service provided by the infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. Now, thanks to digitalization, streams of big data are generated. It can be collected on different aspects of both of the physical and service layers of each of these infrastructure systems. Analytics on top of these streams of big data can then create an additional layer, which we can call data or digitalization layer. This layer is sitting in between the physical and the service and is meant to provide support to both of the two and provide better solutions in terms of having higher efficiency, better return on investment, more sustainability with respect to the three pillars of sustainability, and also more resilient solutions in terms of the lower downtime and faster bounce back when short or long-term shocks happen, or adapting to longer-term shocks. This is our conceptual framework of, so if you go back, this is the conceptual framework of the smart city infrastructure, since the smart city is a buzzword. So yeah, next, I'm going to show a few the same way. So if you go to the next slide, Mohamed, thank you. I'm going to showcase a few examples from the ongoing research in our labs to better highlight the physical and service layers. The first one, the top right, shows the data collected by inertial profiler vehicles from the road pavement roughness. We use the data along with the other environmental data over a couple of consecutive years. And the question was, can we classify the road asset that we have at a national level, and this is the case of Costa Rica, into subcategories which have similar deterioration models, deterioration behaviors. Each color in this figure is showing one of the behavioral groups in terms of the deterioration behavior. The idea is to help the asset manager to better allocate the fund when it comes to the replacement or to repair or maintenance of each of the road segments. The next example, the one in the bottom, so if you click on the next, yeah, thank you. This is from the energy sector, where the consumption data collected at the district level has been used through machine learning to predict medium and long-term loads at the district level. This is a typical application, many, at least very, very common in research, and I know that in the industry as well. The reason why I selected it is to showcase how, if you look from the left to the right, the blue is the predicted, the red is the actual. You can see how we're using more amount of data, so showing that the bigger does matter in cases, showing bigger amount of data and also using the right type of machine learning models could help to achieve more accurate predictions, even capturing the peaks that happen in the system, which are pretty essential. A third example on the top left comes from the water sector. In this example, we're trying to identify microflooding. These are small magnitude events which are spread around the city, and normally they are not sensed or measured by any physical sensor system. Though particularly due to climate change, the frequency of these type of minor incidents are increasing, and it's shown that the compound effect of these minor incidents does matter and can be critical. So believe it or not, we used the source of data that we used to identify this was Facebook and Instagram posts, combined with online local news. The idea was, can we identify these incidents, and can we show them over the time to see whether the frequency is really increasing, whether the spread is increasing. The point is, this, when it comes to the city, in opposed to the building, the city has bigger sprawl and a broad distribution over space. And the broad distribution of infrastructure doesn't allow for mounting a sensor on every single component of every asset. So taking advantage of the end users who are normally distributed in the same pattern as the infrastructure and are interacting with the infrastructure system on a continuous basis can be a solution for monitoring the performance of the infrastructure system. In the next slide, the next two slides, I'm having more and more examples. All of these examples are coming from the use of a Twitter network for capturing the basically opinion of the end users of major infrastructure projects in the city. Examples are taken all from Twitter, as I mentioned. Many of the urban mega projects now have their own Twitter accounts. They become forums for people with common vested interest in the projects to come together and discuss different aspects of those projects. And there are very good sources of data about the ongoing level of service that each of these projects are providing. Analysis of what is being said together with analysis of the networks which are being formed can help in that respect. In this slide, these are my last two examples. The one on the right, Mohamed talked about the occupants' comfort at building level. When it comes to the occupant comfort, it's urban scale level. It's getting harder and harder to go out there and do the interviews to see the level of sensation and level of happiness of people under different conditions. I think the recent election showed us how wrong the polls and the surveys can go. But anyways, we've been using topic modeling and deep learning to train some classifiers and identify comfort under the thermal, visual, noise, amenity and lighting categories from the analysis of comments that people leave in public spaces. The focus here was parks. We used Google review for training the classifiers, and then we tested for different parks. And the last example shows the result of an opinion mining over Twitter for, this is a holistic view of general urban services that people receive in different bureaus of Montreal. So if you go to the next slide, which is my last one, Mohamed talked about the 3 V's. Some people consider veracity to be the 4th V, given the accuracy and quality of the big data analytics, which can be generated through organic procedures. But apart from those V's, to us, the most important V is the last V, which is the value that can be created off of analysis of the big data. So to that ground, I'm hopeful that today's discussions can lead us better towards creating higher value or better value in urban built environments. Let's start with that introduction. Let's start our round tables. We have 4 rooms which are organized around 4 major themes. The activities and discussions will be the same in all of the 4 rooms, but the first room is around the building and energy. The second one is around technology and artificial intelligence. The third one on mobility, and the fourth one on cities and government. The panelists will be assigned to the rooms, and you can find your name. If you're a panelist, you can see your name in the rooms. We have some general audience as well, which will be randomly assigned to one of these rooms. In case you are in the audience side, and in case you were assigned to the room, but you wanted to be in a different room, please don't hesitate to come back to the main area. And there are people there to help you, assign you to the room that you are more interested. So get going.
Just no, so just to go on from this, yeah, I'd like to just open the floor now to Connor, who will explain how we'll be doing the mirror boards, which is part of this engaging discussion that we want to do and using and like running these roundtables. And this is where everybody also that sent us their slides and will have those minutes of introductions for each. So from there, I'll just leave the floor to Connor to show you how this is done. I hope most people had a chance to at least create an account for it, but no pressure if you haven't. We will be also populating these mirror boards in the meanwhile, and not everybody also has to participate in it, but we think it will be very useful. So Connor, please go ahead.
All right, yeah. So, so as mentioned, everyone's going to be split up in different rooms, but there's actually only one mirror board, and on the mirror board, there's these different rooms, so you can go and find the one that you're assigned to. So on the left, we have the names of the panelists, and feel free to edit those as you enter the board. And the idea with this board is it's supposed to replace kind of the paper and sticky notes that you would be using in a real workshop. So that's what we've tried to recreate here. And the board itself is pretty easy to navigate. So you use the scroll on your mouse to zoom in and out, and click and drag to move to navigate around the board. So if you want to use one of the sticky notes, so we have them separated by color, so we know who's added what. You can click and drag one of the sticky notes into the board, double click to edit it, and as you type, you'll see that the text resizes. So each person can enter it using the link provided on the sheet, and I'll also put it in the chat as well.
I just did that, so don't worry.
Oh, you did, perfect. Okay. And so when you're enter, you'll be prompted to create an account, and it should be pretty quick, and then you can enter the board. The only other thing on the left here, you have your panel other items you'll create. So we've tried to generate these sticky notes ahead of time, but one of the useful ones is perhaps this connection arrow. So clicking on this arrow, you can draw connection lines between sticky notes. And this is useful because as you move the sticky notes, the connection line stays connected. And then the only other thing I want to mention is that Control Z or this undo button works very well. So if any time you did something that didn't do what you expected, that is the way you enter it.
So thank you, Connor. And we'll go now into the rooms and like the different tables per se. Like if we had this in person, that's what we would have liked to have. And like, yeah, if anyone has a question on how to use it, or like we'll go navigate through this and also give the floor to our panelists to talk with everyone. So just please join the breakouts as they pop up, and we'll have more discussion on that.
So we've just spotlighted the program for the rest of the day. Right now is a time for summary of results of what happened in your breakout rooms. We're a tiny bit over time because we started a little bit later, but then there's a break coming up. So I hope that gives people a chance to refresh themselves. So Mohamed, since you're here, maybe we'll start with your group for the summary.
Yes, I'll try to give a very quick overview of what we've discussed. I'll just share the screen quickly on our Miro board and just give everybody in a couple of minutes basically what we've discussed. So can everybody see my screen on okay, perfect. So we had the building and energy group, so it was mostly researchers in that field, or hydro like utilities and smart thermostat companies and so on that are involved in data collection for buildings and energy more specifically. So this roundtable was more geared towards that, I guess, and it was easy to find different types of data from utility measurements to GIS data, weather station data. There's quite a lot of types, but one of the issues was also the availability. So what we've learned is there are some programs like the ones from EcoD, for example, where they make some of their data available if the users allow that. But in many other cases, it's not very easy to access, even within, which was interesting to me, even within Hydro-Quebec, even within some of the organizations that do have a lot of data, just for privacy issues, it's not very easy to access data on customers, except if you're doing billing or something, but not for a research purpose. So that was quite insightful here, and there's quite a lot of information on the different types of data sets that you can see. We did talk a lot about the different use cases and R&D activities that are done. So quite a lot of work on model predictive controls for basically controlling building temperature and building operations based on weather predictions. We found some information that we mentioned with this thermostat data on predicting or understanding the thermal performance of buildings, and some interesting, use cases that you wouldn't think of automatically, such as with just temperature measurements from a thermostat, such as looking at actually tracking outages, because from this data you can see if a building has power outages and linking that to hurricanes or other natural disasters and trying to predict that pattern. There's quite some interesting other applications too on understanding appliance use patterns from the energy use data from Pecan Street, quite a lot of others, and just we'll have to maybe just give a quick overview on that. And then with the current gaps and limitations, there's quite a few. I think one of the main things that came up quite a lot during our discussion was the metadata availability, especially when we deal with big data from these utilities or IoT devices and so on. We don't know too much about the buildings, and we're not sure about the accuracy of the data that's provided. In a lot of cases, this is user inputs on how big the house is or how many people live there, but it's not very, like the collection process for that is not very accurate in some cases, or does not give some information. We also have the same issues with data tagging and calibration issues, or equipment become out of date. I would just leave it here and then maybe move on to the next roundtable that we've had. I think Stefanie was one last, so maybe just a quick overview of what was discussed today.
Great. I think we were, we're number 2, the technology and AI group. I don't know that I'll share my screen just out of time's sake, but we had folks have many different sources of urban big data. This includes Bluetooth signals, social media data, smart building data from lots of different sensors, APIs, collaborators with industry, and as you can imagine, the amount of the different ways to access this is across the spectrum, right? So some of it is purchasable, some of it is open and available, and some of it is currently only internal to organizations or universities, but could be made public in the future. We talked about lots of different applications of this data, from contact tracing, very important given the current pandemic situation. Also road traffic estimation, using it to train models of data for various purposes, and worker wellness, employee safety, a range of applications. What we really got stuck into was the final question about what are the gaps and barriers to using urban big data. This includes inaccessible data silos, also the collection of data without very well-defined objectives. Sometimes organizations will have data that want to do something with it, but not have a particular purpose or a way of getting there. There's concern over individuals' perceptions about technology and the use of their data, and their distrust. So that will lend itself to our upcoming conversations, and the need for demonstrating the ethical use of data, perhaps through data governance charters. So lots more to dig into.
Thank you, Stefanie. I don't know. Yeah, so maybe we can move on to Mazdak for the third roundtable.
Yeah, sure thing. Some very nice discussions on the different sources of data. Many of the sources that are used by the partners who were in the room 3 are common with what has been in the other 2 rooms, but also I noticed that a lot more working with publicly available data like open data, as well as the social media was happening in the panel for the panelists in my room. And it was like type of things that were not discussed, like point of interest, a lot of footage, I mean, like images and video processing for autonomous decision making, apparently, are among the data used by people in mobility. And also census data was something that at least 2 of the panelists are using currently. The nice discussion on the volume of the data sometimes becoming so big that it's hard to store it. So it needs edge processing and getting rid of everything other than the analytics, and the analytics being the only thing to be stored. And that was another nice intention in the room. When it comes to the barriers, there was discussion on the quality of the open data. And also the access to the data, access to the granular data was mentioned as one of the most important barriers. The unwillingness of particularly the private parties to share the amount of data, as Mohamed also mentioned. That was one issue, but also another interesting aspect of it was the protocols, the data protocols and the interoperability issues, which even when one party is willing to share, the 2 parties do not speak the same language, and that creates silos, not allowing for a meaningful sharing of data and collaboration between industry and academia. In a nutshell, that's what happened in room number 3.
Thank you very much, Mazdak, and maybe Jing for the last roundtable, if you can just give us an overview of what was discussed there.
Yeah. So in our last group, in the 4th group, we started with the first question, and we talked about different kinds of data. For example, with mobility, with transportation, and we kind of got stuck in the first question and started just with introducing and talking about different types of data that and the storage method that were involved. And then I think a particular interesting point was you were talking about how the city of Montreal deal with the snow removal, the collaboration, and then the data, and then the preparation that was involved in that. We went to question 2, but I think the consensus or kind of a disappointment was that we actually do not know too much about the shared data and how they were actually used once they were shared. We did not get too much chance to talk about the last 2 questions, but we did have a number of very interesting ideas from shares from sticky notes. So for example, in the last one, we talked, here we have sticky notes about the concerns regarding privacy, restore, and then citizen approval, lack of data standards for IoT, and then and so on. So that is basically what we talked about in group 4, and we also discussed the chance of building bridges and then to facilitate further collaboration amongst universities, private sectors, as well as the government.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for all the input. Honestly, I think we had quite a diverse, and I think for us digesting all of this, all of these boards will be quite interesting. I'm just going through what happened in each room. I think for now we are scheduled to go for a short break of about 15 minutes or so, and we'll take just a moment of silence at 11 before we start the second and last roundtable discussion on the privacy and ethical issues when doing this research, or like this other side of this equation, really. So yeah, I'll just go ahead, please. Yeah, if you need to get coffee, water, take any sort of break, and we'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I'll just encourage you to come back to join us. Grab that second coffee or whatever you need to put that extra pep in your step for the second round.
Thank you, Stephanie, and hope everyone is back. Thank you very much. Go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay. Should I just head into the presentation
Please,
mode?
go ahead. I think we should be good to go.
All right, folks. So I'm just going to share my screen. Oops, just a second. Too many things open. There we go. Okay. All right. Can I get confirmation that you are seeing the slides and not the slide notes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So folks, similar to in the first round, we're going to do a quick presentation, Dr. Hu and I, on privacy and stakeholder trust in relation to urban big data. And these are topics that we know you've been thinking about. So we're not here to sort of explain to you issues that are already very much on your minds, but to give you a sense of how we're looking at some of these big concepts from the perspective of scholarly literature and research that we've been diving into over the past few months. So just to dive into this concept of trust, trust can be understood as an expectation by one person, group, or firm of ethically justifiable behavior that is morally correct decisions and actions based upon ethical principles of analysis on the part of another person. And so these terms of ethically justifiable behavior and morally correct, of course, are things that we could talk about onward for months and months. But this is one definition of a way to think about trust. And so trust is an exchange between two parties, the trustor and the trustee, where the trustor is the party who lends their trust over to the trustee. Within this relationship, the trustor becomes vulnerable to the actions of the trustee, and as such, ethically justifiable behavior relies on the trustee, inflicting the least amount of harm as possible on the trustor. Trust in relation to technology is mediated by people's expectations of technology. This has come up a bit already. So people's encounters with and perceptions of technology influence their level of trust. Trust in relation to technology is augmented if people are given the sense that they're interacting with people, right? So rather than interacting with a faceless organization, if you give the sense that people know who you are, and have a sense of that they can trust you and what you're doing with their data. And then trust is also increased through greater digital skills. So greater digital literacy means that people are more likely to trust who they're interacting with online. They're more likely to feel like they can sense what are trustworthy organizations that they're interacting with through digital technology. And greater digital literacy, we know, is connected with higher rates of technology use, which is also shaped by one's access to technology. And this is linked to levels of education and socioeconomic status. I'll pass it over to Dr. Hu to talk about privacy.
Sorry, I was muted for a second. So now we're gonna move to the idea of privacy. So before I jump in to tell you what privacy means, I have to start with the idea of privacy is really not well defined. A little bit of history might help. So the word privacy itself first appeared in the 16th century. So that is 1590, meaning a private matter or secret. And it then developed to include seclusion and a state of freedom from intrusion. So although all such definitions serve from the original term of private, which itself means, as I mentioned, a secret or a secreted or solitude. However, there has been a lot of development ever since then. So the most notable one is from the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, who first made the distinction between politics versus the home, or polis versus autos. So that is the public, the city versus the home, basically. So this divide has been proven to be crucial of how we view the self, individual, the subject, the person. And it has also been continued to shape the development of Western thought. And it is not also interconnected with the notion of privacy to another realm, which is the private is always viewed as the opposite of the public. There are two important political philosophers who contributed a lot to this development. One is John Stuart Mill, the other is John Locke. So they discussed the question in relation to how much authority it is appropriate for a government to have versus how much liberty an individual ought to have to self-regulate. And more importantly, how the concept of privacy relates to the question of property. Right? So they started to discuss the idea of privacy as comparing it to ideas such as ownership, such as labor, such as rights. And then that resulted us to see privacy as sometimes a right. We tend to think that privacy is a basic right. Well, I have to say that there's currently no consensus exists on the definition of privacy or exactly what privacy is, even though we all agree it's a very important idea. It is generally agreed that privacy entails both the right to be left alone and also the power to have control over one's own private information and its dissemination. And well, typically, in the past, we have been seeing privacy as a right, but because defining it as a right can be both ambiguous and give us very little practical guidelines, now there has been a shift of seeing privacy not as a right, but actually as a value or as an interest. As an interest, meaning that we can calculate, we can negotiate, we can consider it with other competing factors. So, so instead of seeing privacy as comparing to concepts like liberty, freedom, autonomy, we're starting to see it as something as a more dynamic nature, as interest and as value. So that's, I'll hand the floor back to Dr. Duguay.
Okay, great. Yeah, so it's dynamic and context matters. So in relation to urban big data, privacy concerns largely center on how personal data is accessed, disseminated, and monetized. Citizens worry about surveillance, about intrusive infringements into their personally identifying information, and they have a general uncertainty over how their data is being used, who's making money off of it, what third parties are accessing it, is it accessible by government and law enforcement. This uncertainty over how data is being used can give rise to feelings of powerlessness in people. We know that when it comes to digital data, a lot of the time, people are sharing data in a particular context, such as social media, a particular platform. So they view privacy as being able to control that context where their data is deployed and encountered. So for example, hoping that your Facebook post stays on Facebook. We also know that people experience data privacy risks differently depending on their social, political, and economic status. And so as a result, data about individuals' gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, ability or disability, and geographic location may be sensitive and require extra protection. And so with all of this in mind, data can be used, as all of you are using it in some way, as we're talking about today. And through the inclusion of citizen voices in the built environment, data can become a social and collective rather than private resource. This can be made possible through citizens being engaged in cooperative measures where they are viewed as co-producers of data and data-related solutions, rather than merely sources of data. It can also be achieved through greater transparency of data use, so citizens are more willing to make themselves vulnerable to corporations and other data trustees when these organizations provide transparency in how their data is being used. And citizens need to also see the positive outcomes for their quality of life, right? So a goal of enhancing the built environment is to enhance people's quality of life, and citizens are most attuned to the problems in their environments. And so if they see that they can be part of these processes, then greater trust can be established. So we hope that this quick overview of big concepts has gotten the wheels turning for our next roundtable discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie and Jing. We will now move on to the breakout rooms. I think we have the same assignments for it. For people other than the panelists, if you're interested, the same thing, if you're interested to go to another room, just please go back to the main session and we will reassign you. But for the most part, it's going to be the same groups because we won't have, we'll only have 45 minutes, so we won't have time for new introductions at that point. Yeah, I think we can get started on this right away.
Perfect. As people are coming back in, should we do a roundtable of summaries once again? And I see that's the case. So maybe I'll start with you, Jing. Are you good to go?
So is that group 4?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So we have discussed a number of very interesting questions. So I'm not going to share the Miro board now because I think it's visible to all of you. So we talked about the ethical aspect of data collecting and data sharing. And in particular, we were talking about even if the data were analyzed and then went through the identification, sometimes we can still consider privacy being breached and violated if the data were used for the purpose that's against the person's will, right? So we talked about that possibility, and we, in terms of the more vulnerable and then marginalized group of the society, we talked about the people who might not have the education, the energy, the time, the money to manage their own online presence, to manage their own privacy. Because nowadays we a lot of times think of, privacy is it's the individual's own job to, maintain a social presence as one that is that accords to their own standard. So a lot of times if the burden is on the individual, then obviously it creates a unfair burden on the individual, especially those who have relatively less resource. So those are the interesting points that we talked about.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jing. Shall I go over to Stephanie's group next? Stephanie, are you ready to summarize? Oh, sorry, you were together. My bad. I'll go over to you, Mohamed.
I think actually Stephanie was not in the same room.
No?
Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so you can go ahead, Stephanie, I'll go after that.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I encourage people to take a look at our Miro board set. We first, for the first question, talked about a lot of different privacy and security measures. We talked a little bit about how government regulation sometimes gets in the way of more broadly what you want to do with data sets. It's there to protect users, but sometimes it means that you have to pre-specify the data that you want to use, and you may be starting out, you may not know yet what data you can get access to or what data might be useful to combine. So we actually spent most of the time on the second screen, kind of talking about this question of personally identifying information and anonymization, talking again about how something can be sensitive personal information in certain contexts and not others. So it really depends on the scenario, the data set, the people involved. So some sensitive data could include social relationships or location metadata. Location actually came up a lot as sensitive, potentially sensitive data. And then different methods for dealing with this, right? Trying to calculate the risk, trying to use models like k-anonymity or trying to use hashing. But a lot of these can be broken or are complicated to implement. And then we got into a really fascinating conversation about this question of a lot of the time academia and other realms are looking at the question of discrete data sets. You know, here's a data set, how do I anonymize it? Whereas in industry and other areas, people are looking at data flows or data streams, where you actually treat data as it's coming in from multiple different sources, and then you're harnessing it for these different purposes. And so in that, we have to think about how can we protect sensitive data. You know, for example, if something is cascading down these streams into different applications, how might we remove someone's personal data if they want that removed from all of those different, what we would think of as data sets. And then also, how do we get individuals involved in helping to design these data streams and how data is collected and applied? So big conversations.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. Mazdak, would you like to go ahead and report back?
Of course. The second roundtable was when I think all the ices were thawed, and there was a lot of discussion going on. It was very interesting discussion. We talked about different protocols for collecting data. GDPR was discussed. And also we were discussing the type of attributes which are directly collected and have personal, basically, characteristics assigned to them, such as the name, email, address, living, and so on and so forth. And also the other set of data from which some personally related attributes can be inferred, such as the travel behaviors or living behaviors in general. So there was discussion on how disconnecting these two from one another can protect the privacy of the people that the data belongs to. That's the first round of things that we discussed. Then we discussed different technologies for protecting the privacy. Of course, the cybersecurity based technologies are big, but also we discussed the edge computing as one enabler for protecting some of this data. For example, for any image processing based applications, instead of keeping the images for a long time, the processing can happen at the edge level, and the juice being the information and knowledge being stored, which is normally lacking the private related information or personal related information. The idea of synthetic population, generation of synthetic population in transportation and mobility modeling was also discussed, where instead of collecting, we collect information from the real people, real individuals, but then creating virtual agents and using them for transportation planning rather than working with the actual people. And also the idea of use of blockchain to protect the basically anonymity of the users was also discussed, along with the limitations and the things that need to be in place. One very interesting topic that was discussed was the fact of who the data belongs to. And one of the panelists discussed an interesting case of a city in the States going to the Google and paying money from the taxpayers' pocket to buy back the travel data, which initially comes from originally belongs to the citizens. So the idea of the ownership of the data and to whom the data belongs, is it the individuals from whom the data is being collected, or is it whoever is collecting that data? That was another thing. And in order to address the last question, in terms of where to head, the panelists were somehow in consensus that a lot of data is being generated and shared. A lot of personal and private data is generated and shared. People are sharing this type of data in platforms such as Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, because in many cases they can see right away the value that is added by sharing that data. It can be as simple as fun, or it can be making money, or whatever it is. But when it comes to the research and development in a built environment, probably since we've not been able to clearly showcase what values are generated from the data, then that might be one reason why many of the private entities hesitate to share the data. So there was an emphasis on the fact that the knowledge and value generated off of the analysis of this type of data must be showcased back, and less basically restrictions must be put when it on the research, and particularly the research and development in academia or industry, in terms of sharing the data with them. Those were, I think, the highlights of what was discussed in the third room.
Great, thank you, Mazdak. And Mohamed, that leaves you.
All right, thank you, Anna, and thanks everyone for very insightful comments. For our room, we had quite an interesting set of discussions as well. Just to recall, our room was more on the building and energy sector, so we don't deal with the privacy issues as much, but there were quite some interesting points that were raised. So first of all, in most cases, a lot of the rules and the regulations, let's say, that organizations are dealing with are mostly self-made or like voluntarily enacted by the organizations, rather than being like just by what they understand as being like what to do to maintain privacy, rather than having a specific law, for example, that you have to deal with when dealing with our type of data. With it also referred to some regulations that exist. The EU GDPR came up, although not within our context of the people that are in the room that we deal with that much, but it's something that we're definitely aware of. Interestingly, from Pecan Street, California, I think they mentioned that for the data, at least that they're collecting from homes in California, there's some specific regulations that are that they have to meet in terms of what information to relate to customers and so on. But again, for the most part, a lot of it is enacted by the organization to protect privacy and to make sure that there are no issues. From an academic standpoint, one of the things we always obviously deal with is the research ethics board within our institutions that deal with any data that could be personally identifying. With the second question for personally identifying information, we don't think that there's a lot, but that could be inferred, or at least that was the first thing, and we didn't know why it could be, like one of the questions at least that were asked is why could this be an issue, and this was quite interesting, because in a lot of cases it's like we're using this to make better policies, let's say for lower income neighborhoods or lower income housing and so on, and to understand a little more about how their energy is being used. So that was quite an interesting topic. And in terms of how profit sharing and so on is done, there's not necessarily a specific protocol, but there are some cases with like organizations that are providing some infrastructure like this, the sensors or the thermostats for free to users, so that that's some way of trying to make sure that it's that this is the incentive, let's say, for people to share their data. There was the interesting point that actually a couple of interesting points, but one of the things was that voluntarily, like asking people to voluntarily share their data would actually allow you to have a lot more people are more willing if they know what they're sharing it for. So just communicating that aspect was quite an important point, and that's pretty much it for this specific point. Now, moving on to the issues of marginalized stakeholders. As I mentioned, one of the things we didn't know how much of this is being is coming up with energy usage data, but it's something that we think can be useful in essence. But it's quite an interesting point to try to look at policies that can make sure that this data is used for purposes that wouldn't harm marginalized communities. One interesting point that was raised is that also what was noticed is that lower income groups were usually more worried or less trustworthy with how they're was sharing their data or was providing data to organizations, rather than, at least personally, I thought it might be the other way around, that some of the higher income might be more concerned about privacy issues. That was interesting to note. And lastly, with the last question on the long-term issues, I think we all had the consensus that there should be some more industry self-policing. We do realize that one issue in one company, if it's blows up in the media or something, can affect the whole industry, even if they're not dealing with the exact same issues. So that's something that needs to be addressed with more general best practices. Let's say that can certify an organization to collect data, can make it more trustworthy, let's say, for different stakeholders. That's more or less it. You can go through our board as well and go through it, and would be happy to summarize also the outcomes of this workshop and send it to everyone. Also the slides, I think a few people have asked for it, so I'm happy to do that. And yeah, that wraps it up. So I want to thank you all again, and I'll leave the floor to Anna, but thank everyone again for everything, all the work in this workshop.
Thanks, Mohamed. And I've just popped a little survey into the chat. It'll take 30 seconds. It would be great if you could give our collaborators here some feedback, any ongoing questions or concerns that you might have after today's workshop. So I'll just say on behalf of us here at ForSpace, so Douglas and I, who have been in the background with you all day, we'd like to thank your participation today. We have recorded the proceedings and won't release anything without any consent or approvals from all, but we will put the video together for our collaborators, Mohamed, Jing, Stefanie, and Mazdak, so that they can reflect on the results and as they negotiate the next steps of what to do with all of this information. Again, thanks for your time today and the incredible amount of behind the scenes work that went into making this happen. And to our Miro miracle workers, Connor, Mohamed, Rafaela, and Kristen, thank you as well. That's great work today. Bon appetit to all, and thanks again for joining us this morning. It's a great session. Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.